What does white do here? What do you think? Hello, welcome to my video. In this video I'm going to cover this very instructive endgame played in the game between Anthony Saidy and Robert Fischer from the US Championship in 1963. We have this bishop versus knight endgame. It looks very drawish, but black is the one who can somehow press for a win. If there were no d pawns, then the position would be rather dull, and I think white would have better chances because the king could have been more active if there's no d pawns. But in this case, there is no king activity for white. Let's get to the game. Black was to move, and he tried to improve his knight, to post it on e6. So he went knight d7, king f1, and now knight f8. The whole point of this is to restrict white's pieces, to force at least one piece to defend on d4. White activates his king by king e2, but now knight e6, king d3, and black starts expanding on the king side by h5. He tries to include his king into the play by king h7, king g6, to further expand on the king side by g5, g4, and try to induce some weaknesses on the king side. Now white decides to defend passively and he plays bishop e3. I think that something that will make his defense easier is if he went for king c3. And in case of black doing the same as he did in the game, to go bishop e3, king g6, and now king b4. To try to activate his king to the maximum, and now king a5, king b6 is a really powerful threat. If black plays b6, now white can play a4. And on the next move he's going to play a5. To force him to play b5. Let's say black plays king f5, a5, and black cannot capture on a5 because then the pawn on a6 might be vulnerable. b5 is the best. And now we are in some kind of stalemate. Knight has to stay on e6, bishop has to stay on e3 to defend the pawn. So now after f3 to not allow king e4, as black you cannot do much progress here. But instead he went for bishop b3, nothing wrong with this, but it's also a passive defense. He doesn't try to get to b4. Now Fischer goes king h7, f3, king g6, and now after a4, king f5. Black did what he wanted, he got his king to f5. Now white goes back to e2, and now the expansion starts. And the point of this expansion, like I said before, is to provoke some weaknesses on the king side. White went king f2, knight d8, bishop d2, and now king goes back to g6. But now they just shuffle a bit. And now f6. I think he was playing this slowly so he can gain time after the move 40. After move 40 he would figure out much better how to proceed. King e2, king g6, and finally he plays this f5 move. He wants to play f4 to fix his opponent's pawns on the light squares, because then the bishop cannot defend them. It seems counterintuitive to put your pawns on the collar of the opponent's bishop, but in this case it proves to be a really nice strategy, because now only the king can defend those pawns. King goes back to e2, and now f4. Bishop f2, and now the knight goes to f5. He went for this, h3, knight f5, and king d3 now. And Fischer plays g4. Problem for white is that he cannot avoid capturing on g4. He would like to keep it like this, but if he simply waits like king c3 or king e2, let's say, then black plays g3. And after bishop g1, the bishop is stuck on g1, and basically black is playing with extra piece. And if he goes to e1, then d4 pawn hangs. In case of king c3, then still g3 happens, but with a different idea. If the bishop goes to g1, this is the most effective move, because now you can take on g2, play knight e1 if the king goes up the board. Yeah, knight h4 and capturing on g2 is a problem here. So that's why white has to capture on g4. Takes, and takes again. Again, if you avoid this exchange by bishop e1, then there is knight e3, and the g2 pawn is under attack. If g3 happens, then first black plays knight g2, and then he takes on f3. White is losing a pawn, and there's nothing to do. So he took again, and knight h6. And now after black recaptures on g4, he will get his king to f5 and slowly press white to be more passive. In this position, white made a huge mistake. He played bishop e1, which was a losing move. If white tried to eliminate the last pawn by playing g3, now black has knight g4, and if bishop e1, then f3. The threat is f2, trapping the bishop. Now if bishop goes to d2, then first king goes to h5, and after this to go to f6. And now the king supports the pawn, and after king e3, king g4, now knight e4 is a very nice threat. He will capture eventually on g3 and finish the game. The move that was saving the game was king e2, getting the king to f3. If this happens, white can play bishop g1, and after king goes to f5 to go to f3. And now black's issue is that once the knight goes back, bishop goes to h2, attacking the pawn. And this pawn proves to be a liability, not the strength. After knight f6, bishop h2, and after knight h5, just fix those pawns by pushing a5. After this, just g4, and white eventually eliminates the pawn on f4. This endgame is a total draw. And around here, before the knight goes to f6, if he tries this, this might prove to be risky, because after b3, b6, white has a move like g3, and these pawns stay on the dark squares. And once the bishop gets active, if it gets active, I mean, black can always repeat moves by playing this. But imagine that the knight goes back to f6, now the bishop might get active, get some counterplay, and black's best option might be here just to repeat moves. But unfortunately for white, white played bishop e1, and now black took. There was no hope for a move like g3 because there's f3. So he went for this. In this case, king e2 doesn't work. Now it doesn't work because after king f5, king f3, now there is this check. Very unfortunate. And once the king goes back, king enters, and it's impossible to defend this. Once the king gets to e4, now black will just transfer his knight to f5, like this, and the d4 pawn will be undefended. If he tries this, then black just captures. And again, black gets to e4 with the king. And there's no possibility to defend this pawn, and the endgame is lost for white. So he chose here bishop d2. King gets to f5, and white plays this. Knight f6, bishop h4, knight e4. Now the king is getting to g4. King e2. The point is that he was trying to get to h4 with the knight. Something like knight g3, knight f5, knight h4. Every single of those endgames is lost for white, because let's say king e2, what was played in the game, knight g3. If you take, then king g3. And now he attacks the g2 pawn and uses this pawn as a hook to force you to give up some space. After this, he will just capture the pawn on d4, and the endgame is lost. Here, if he went for king f2, then knight f5 back, and if bishop c3 to defend the pawn, knight e3. White is in Zugzwang, because if he goes to e2, then take on g2. If this, then f3. And now the pawn on g2 is under pressure, so it has to capture, and now the king enters. And in the end, the d4 pawn will be just hanging. It's a lost position for white. He tried this, but after knight f5, bishop f2, he still tries to hold on to this position, but after knight h4, now again, white cannot capture like this, because this pawn endgame is, it's just lost. After this, again, like I showed you before, black enters, takes the pawn on d4, and it's over. So in this position, black is taking the g2 pawn. White plays a5 here, but he takes on g2, king c3, king f3. And after a couple of more moves, he's just losing. And after 93, white resigned because now he's not even able to give up the bishop for a pawn, which might give him some counter chances with king b4, king c5, capturing the pawn. But in this case, he cannot stay on this diagonal, which is important to call this f-pawn. Now the bishop gets lost or just stays away from this diagonal, and now the f-pawn just promotes cleanly to a queen. So that was it. If you look at this position in the beginning and imagine that there is no d4 and d5 pawn, white's position is much easier. Black doesn't have free hands like he did in the game, because white's king was so restricted and it wasn't easy for white to arrange some counterplay. It was all on the one side because of this blockaded center, and that's it. Thank you so much for watching this, and if you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section. I will answer to you, and see you soon. Bye.